Hello friends, welcome to DotVVM Loves .NET Conf 2022. My name is Thomas Hersek. I'm a founder of DotVVM project. DotVVM is one of the members of .NET Foundation, and I'm so thrilled to be here with you today, where we will be talking about the great new things and great new features that were presented at .NET Conf 2 weeks ago. So what this live streamed event will be about? First, I would like to mention the biggest announcements for web developers that were presented at .NET Conf, especially .NET 7 and C# 11, the new features in the C# language which we can use now. And because this event is created by the .vvm team, me and my colleagues from the .vvm project, we will share some things that we will be releasing shortly in .vvm 4.1, and a lot of news in .vvm 4.1 has connections to the things that were announced at .NET Conf, so stay tuned, and I hope that you will see some cool stuff that you can use in your project and your applications as well. So for those of you who didn't hear about .vvm, it's an open source framework. As I said, we are members of the .NET Foundation, and basically it's a web framework for .NET developers. So if you want to build web applications using model view model approach, you can use .vvm because it will feel very natural to you. If you have previous experience with WPF or .NET MAUI or Xamarin, you will find this way of building applications very familiar because it's MVVM. And of course, also if you have old legacy ASP.NET applications, you can use .vvm to modernize these applications because .vvm supports the newest .NET 7 as well as the old .NET Framework 4.7.2, which is the oldest version we support. Of course, we support also the newer versions of .NET Framework. I will be talking about the modernization stuff in a few minutes. So what we will cover today in this live event: first, I will recap some of the most interesting announcements about .NET 7, especially in the performance area, and also what's new in ASP.NET Core. And I will also dig into some features in C# 11 because they really improved a lot of things that me as a developer, I was waiting for them for a couple of years. So now I'm really happy to be able to use these features. And then me and my colleagues, we will be talking about .vvm things. First, you will see how you can integrate React components in .vvm pages. .vvm allows you to build web applications without deep knowledge of JavaScript, but if you want to integrate third-party controls, you can do that, and there is plenty of components for React, so you don't need to build your own controls. You can just use the controls which are out in the world. Also, .vvm 4.1 brings a new feature called Auto UI, and basically it can help you generate user interface based on the data model. Probably you have seen such a technology in other frameworks as well. I remember when I started with ASP.NET Web Forms, there was a library Dynamic Data, and also in MVC and other frameworks there are things that you will just pass an object and it will generate all form for you, or the editor for that particular property. So Auto UI does the same thing, and we have improved this library, created a new API so you can use this in your applications. And after that, my colleagues will show you the support of new data types which were added in .NET 6. You can use date only, time only, and also a feature that I'm really thrilled about is strongly typed IDs. In many applications, you can use GUID or integer as a primary key. However, if you want to make sure that you will not like confuse or misassign, like for example, ID of a customer to ID of a product, you can create a thing called strongly typed IDs. There's also several libraries for that, or you can implement it your own. And we have added support into .vvm, so you can extend this framework to be able to handle these identifier types with which are represented by your own classes. And also we have recently published a new extension for Visual Studio Code. We had a very old extension which didn't work really well, so we decided to rewrite most of the code, and we have published this extension. So my colleague Standa will be talking about that. So let's look first at what's new in .NET 7. If you missed the keynote 2 weeks ago, it was really nice. There had a lot of charts. I just want to summarize the biggest news for us to know. So same as in the previous versions, Microsoft focused, or not only Microsoft, because .NET is also developed by the community, and the involvement of the community is quite huge. So the people standing behind .NET, they improved or made about 1,000 pull requests with optimizations of focused on optimizing the performance of different kind of APIs. So you could also read a lot of nice blog posts by Steven Taub on MSDN blogs. I remember reading a very long blog post about how they improved performance of regular expressions and other things. So there is many pull requests focused just on performance optimizations of existing API, and it's in .NET 7. They had a comparison because even in previous versions in .NET 5, .NET 6, there were performance improvements, but the number of PRs is the biggest in .NET 7. Also, there was a chart with Tech Empower benchmark. It's one of the repos which tries to compare the speed of various frameworks and technologies. Just be careful about interpretation of these numbers, because like from one of the benchmark, it looks like ASP.NET Core 7 is 11 times faster than Node.js, but you need to look at the exact benchmark, what is exactly being benchmarked, because it didn't use full MVC controllers or things like that, or routing, things like that. It's just basically it just measures how fast can ASP.NET parse the incoming HTTP request, pass it to your own code, and then like how to take the results from your code and send it back on the wire. So like it was just for plain text responses. So like you can take it that as a theoretical top speed you can get from a pure HTTP server. So the number is nice, but if you will use any infrastructure on top of that, routing, MVC controllers, or .vvm, of course, there is much more things involved, so you would need to look for another benchmark. But on the other hand, even things like JSON serialization, which is crucial for any kind of API endpoints, it gets 16% faster in .NET 7 than in .NET 6. So if you are using the new system text JSON, you can benefit from that without changing a single line of code in your application. Also, there was an interesting graph about support for ARM, because not only Apple and not only on Linux, even in Windows, Microsoft recently announced that even Visual Studio and .NET Framework runs on ARM64. So they also made sure that .NET 7 is fast, and then the performance improvements will consider ARM64 also. So you can see on the charts that the performance of classic 64 and ARM 64 is quite close to each other. So there is like, it's not like the ARM would be some second class citizen. It should be the you can expect the same performance as on classic 64-bit platforms. Also, a lot of improvements were done if you are trying to publish your app as a container, because you could choose several base images for your containers. A lot of people were choosing Ubuntu because you have a reasonable amount of libraries, but the container was quite big. It had like 200 megabytes and things like that. So now there is also a chiseled Ubuntu container which has about half of the size. But it's of course it's a bit harder for debugging, because if you want to like run a shell in the container or look in the file system, you don't have any tools, you don't have any package manager. So it's great for production use, but for development scenarios where sometimes you have to dig inside the container and look what's going on there, it should be this container will not be that great for a developer perspective or performance. Also, if you want to create Docker container, you don't need to have a Docker runtime present on your machine, because you can just the format of the Docker images is basically standardized, so not only Docker can create it, you can create the image using other tools. So .NET Publish has a new way, or new option that will tell this tool just publish the app as a container, and it will directly produce the Docker image. It can also push it to some container registry, and there is a lot of MS Build related properties which you can use to customize how your image will look like. So if you will add few lines of code in your CSproj file, you can like tell how would be the name of the container, what version it will be, what architecture, and things like that. So it's quite interesting, because on my developer machine, when I install Docker and when I try to run Docker workloads, everything gets slower, because like my machine is not the top speed. It's quite small laptop, so I'm quite happy that I will be able to output the container without Docker runtime. And also it can be useful in CI/CD scenarios, because if you, for example, if your build agents are already Docker containers, and during your build you need to provide another container to create another container, you would need Docker runtime inside of this thing that is already running in Docker. So then it gets complicated. You have to route the Docker API to the outside container, which has a lot of security considerations. So being able to just create Docker image and push it to the registry without having Docker installed, it's great improvement for even for the CI/CD scenarios. If you are using Entity Framework Core 7, there is also quite a lot of interesting things happening. For example, if you want to use distributed transactions, your code is working with multiple databases, and you need to be able to commit everything or nothing, then there is support for distributed transactions. And also, a very nice feature is a support for JSON columns. So you can say this column will contain JSON objects or JSON values, and in that property of the C# class, you can have any complicated structure, any complex structure of objects or arrays, or objects with arrays, or objects with objects inside, and it will get serialized as a JSON to a JSON column. And if you are using a database engine that can index the JSON, you can also query on that. So it could be a very nice scenario, because if the database supports JSON and can do indexing, the queries on these columns would be really fast. So I can imagine a lot of domain-driven design scenarios where you can use this. On projects in our company, we have been using Martin, which is also a very nice library which works with Postgres SQL. So hopefully this will also allow working with JSON in other databases as well. Some databases cannot index JSON columns, but on the other hand, if the performance for that is not critical, you can use this feature as well. There is also a huge improvement in bulk updates. If you were used to write a code where you create a lot of entities at the same time, or you need to load some data and create some big modifications and then call context save changes async. You were waiting for some time because it takes the entity framework was just sending these updates and inserts and deletes one by one. Now it can do proper bulk updates, so it can be also quite a significant performance improvement if you need to modify a lot of records at the same time. Entity Framework Core also comes with scaffolding templates. You can, if you want to scaffold your DB context from a database, you can customize the templates which are generating the code. So if you are not using the code first approach, but you are using the scaffold way, you can customize your templates, and if your DBA then changes the schema, you can easily regenerate the DB context and fine-tune it so it will look like exactly as you need in your project. And if you are used for inserting, updating, deleting using calling stored procedures, then EF Core 7 supports this as well. So I hope that this feature will help you to get better performance or get better support in your applications, because I can imagine that most of the applications are still using the relational database, and EF Core is of course quite a popular choice for a lot of developers. Let's go to ASP.NET Core 7. So we have the runtime, which get a lot of performance optimization, which is great. And on top of that, you have ASP.NET Core, which presents several new middlewares. So for example, if you are making API and you want to do rate limiting, you had to do it by yourself, or you had to put some API gateway in front of the API. Now there is a middleware that can easily calculate how many requests each client is sending, and based on that it can produce meaningful responses with HTTP codes. Also, there is a new middleware for output caching. So if you want to reuse some parts of generated strings, generated output, you can use this middleware as well. ASP.NET Core has support for HTTP 3, which should be even faster than HTTP 2. And in HTTP 2 stack, there was also a lot of performance optimizations going on. If you are curious, just search for HTTP 2, .NET 7 and channels, because what's interesting in this very long and very insightful blog post, look, you can see how long it's at, is that in ASP.NET Core, on many places, there was a concurrent queue being used. And this queue is designed so it would work well in the environment where there are multiple threads, but not that great when there is a very huge load. So basically, they implemented a new API in system.threading.channels, and it's explained here, and it should work even better in a high concurrency environment. So this helped the team to avoid a lot of locking, a lot of thread contention issues, because these channels were better designed for this scenario. And it's part of the API, so you can use it in your applications as well. Let's go back to the presentations. Also, there were improvements in SignalR or any WebSockets technology, because WebSockets can now work on HTTP2. The support for that was, I think in previous version, it was just experimental. Now it's there. And so these are the benefits. So the entire platform, ASP.NET Core, which we are using, no matter what web framework are using on top of ASP.NET Core, it should be faster as well. So if you just upgrade, you should benefit from these improvements. There is also new things happening in WebAssembly world. Of course, everybody is excited about Blazor, but now it's also possible to have basically a console application without any UI framework, without any libraries from ASP.NET Core, just console application that can be compiled into WebAssembly, and there is a way for interop between this code and between JavaScript. So you can mark some methods with JS import or JS export attributes, and it will allow you to load this WebAssembly from JavaScript and then run some .NET code in that, call .NET exports, and also call JS code. So if your .NET code needs to, for example, access the current time of the browser or the current location which is loaded on which URL the browser is standing right now, like you can wrap and easily call JavaScript functions from .NET and vice versa. And there is a lot of things happening for marshalling the values. So like if you send some type which is not supported by the JavaScript, it will be emulated in some JS related mechanism. For example, in .NET we have tasks, in JS we have promises. So this bridge will also make conversions between task and a JavaScript promise. So you can have a C# function which returns a task of something, and on the JavaScript side it will look like a function which is returning a promise. Yeah. So this is a very nice integration, and in .vvm team we are quite excited about that, because that will allow anyone to easily call JavaScript code on the client. Right now .vvm uses C# code, but every time it's executed on the server, so there has to be HTTP communication. If you need to call some C# from the page, you need to invoke or create HTTP communication. So this will allow to move some workloads to the client. If you are building APIs, in .NET 6 there was a new feature called minimal APIs, which is very nice for easy small applications which just produce several endpoints. Now with minimal APIs you have more features which you can use. So for example, you can use action filters, so you can apply global like filters, like for example exception handling or permission checks or any kind of like interception for your API endpoints, and it can be easily wrapped as a filter. Also, for example, if you want to work with arrays in query strings, like in this URL it would be like /tags, question mark, and then q equals first value and q equals second value and q equals third value. Now minimal APIs can map this. So for example, you can pass array of integer values and it will get into this q array. So this will work. In previous version you couldn't do that, you had to parse your query string by yourself. Also, minimal APIs now support open API definitions, so you can easily emit your open API JSON and then generate client libraries for any of the languages that are supported. Maybe if you don't know the open API name, if I say Swagger, probably a lot of people will know what it means. Swagger is just an implementation. Open API is the standard on top of which this is working. So you can then add Swagger UI, which will read this open API definition and it will render its UI and it will allow you to generate the codes. There is also support for route groups. So if you want to map several routes with a common prefix, for example, you can create it as a route group. And also there is support for uploading files, so you can accept like the e-file, form file or things like that, structures like that. Until now you had to go into the MVC, which could bind these things without any problems. Let's look at one news we have in the C#. I think that a lot of people have fallen in love with this init setters, because it allows you to make sure that the value will be immutable. It can be set only via this object initializer, but not later. Of course, you can use reflection, but like if you want to make sure the code will run and you want these checks to have at the compile time, then you should avoid that. But the problem is, for example, if you had this property with just a string attribute and it didn't allow the null value, the compiler would produce a warning. Yeah, so like here you see that even if there is the init setter, there is no guarantee that someone who is using this property would actually call this initializer. So that's why this was underscored. And there was a common like hack what you can do. You could like say null and exclamation mark, which tells, yes, I know that null should not be there, but I know what I'm doing. So, it was quite a common pattern. A lot of people were doing this. In C#11, you can use required keyword, which will tell that this property must be set using this object initializer. So if it's not set, then it will not be possible to work with that. Also, if this class would be an attribute, there are no object initializers in the attribute, but you can set it in the constructor, so it will work the same. Like if it's required, it needs to be set. Otherwise, you will get a compile error. So for example, if I say this is required, now this is a compile error because I didn't set the required property. So I have to say this, and now everything is good, everything is happy. So this required keyword is quite useful because you can avoid using the null bank. I call it hack, maybe it's not hack, maybe it's a standard solution for a problem, but it disappears now with this required keyword. So that's first thing that was introduced, and it's very nice because you can say just public required string first name, and it means that this needs to be set in the object initializer. Also, I have been playing a lot with generic methods, but when it comes to the number types, there is a lot of number types in .NET, and there was no way how to say I want any numeric type to work with this method. Now you can use this constraint, like where T is implementation of a type I number of T, and this interface specifies a lot of things that every numeric type should implement. Yeah. So if I go here, we can see I'm creating a sum method which will get array of items, and it should like calculate the sum of all the items. And you can see I am calling it with integers and with doubles, and it should work with every type. Here is the constraint that T is I number of T. Without this constraint, of course, this would not work. Even if I would put 0, it wouldn't work because this is a problem. It doesn't know how I can actually add two T's together, yeah, because it doesn't know that this operator is declared here. And also, like 0, it doesn't work for a lot of things. Here I have set just 0, but it's like integer. So I could probably say like default of T, and now it would work somehow, but still I have the problem with this addition. But if I put here this constraint, it's fine, it will work. And I also have T.0, which represents 0 in this exact numeric type. So because here is this constraint, now I can use this T.0. And I can also use addition, and it's everything is green, everything is fine. So this is a very nice improvement. All of this is possible because interfaces can now have static members. You can see that I'm calling T.0. T is not an instance, it's a type. So this is basically a static member on an interface. Yeah? If I press F12, it will take some time because it needs to decompile that. You can see here I have interface number base, I number base, and it contains static abstract T self, 0, 1, and radix, and other things which we can use. So you can see that now you can put static things in the interfaces, which is really nice, really nice thing. Also, you can put operators, which are basically static methods, in the interface as well. So if you look in this interface, e-addition operators, and if I go here, you can see that I'm implementing this operator. It's part of the interface. So you can now make interface that tells, okay, if somebody implements this type, they need to implement this exact operator, which is also very interesting. And also even methods like try parse and things like that, they are also declared here. So for example, you can see there is an iParsable or something like that. It should be here. Let's go in this iNumber definition. Yeah, and there should be also iParsable. I'm not sure why it's not here. Maybe I'm just... Yeah, here is iSpan parsable, for example, and maybe there will be a normal parsable as well. But this should like work with parse and try parse. Yeah, here is also iParsable. So here is also standard parse and try parse methods, which you can find. So it's very interesting and very nice. You can now use static members in the interfaces. And also, there is a very nice extension for patterns. If you get used to this switch syntax, you can now use it for lists as well. So I'm using items and this switch expression. And if because items is an array, I can use these like arrays or list patterns. So for example, if it's empty array, I will be returning t.0, yeah, for sum. If there is just one member, sum of array with one member is just I. And you can also use this double dot operator, which is basically the rest argument. So for example, give me first item in the array into I, and this will be array of t, and because they're here, we have these two dots, so it will be array of here. So I can use recursion, and now I can call the sum method here. Yeah, so this is another functional implementation of sum. Of course, I could maybe I could remove this, because this would match even an array with one item, because this would just be an empty array, so it would work like that also. Yeah, so it's quite interesting, and of course you can use patterns recursively inside. So if it's array of arrays, you can of course use these things. So it's also a very nice feature of the C# language. And another thing that I think everybody will start using quite quickly is strings with multiple quotes, because sometimes you need to paste a piece of JSON or piece of HTML in your code, and the double quotes are natural part of these things. So even if you want to have a string with double quoted strings, like even in double quotes, you can use any number of these double quotes at the beginning. So here I have 3 double quotes. And it means that anything shorter than 3 double quotes will be just considered as a part of the string. So like this will be normally here. Yeah, so and I can always use more quotes. So if the string contains double quotes, it will still work. And also it supports multiple lines, and it supports trimming. So the position of these ending double quotes will say that this code is indented, but because these double quotes start here, so I will be ignoring first 2 spaces on every line. So this yellow part will not be part of the string. Let's see the demo. I have this short demo here. So you can see I'm using quadruple double quotes. Why not? Because I can, but I have the most I have is single double quotes, so like it would work with this as well. But I can use, I need to use at least 3. So that's fine. But like otherwise it should be fine. And the position of these quotes will determine the indentation. So if I run this, you will see that in the code it's indented, but here it will not be indented. Oh my god, what happened? Yeah, so you can see it's not indented because the position of these quotes is right here. If I move these quotes to here and try to run it, you will see that now I have 2 spaces because like this difference is 2 spaces, so it will just consider this to be a part of the string. Yeah. So that's very nice. And also you can see that these quotes have the end of line here, but in the output it's not here, it's on the first line. So if this first line is empty, if this is just at the end of the line, it will just ignore it, and this beginning of the string will be on this place actually. And also the last line will be also ignored. Yeah. So this is pretty useful, and I think that this will be my favorite string literal because it supports a lot of things that I can need in my C# code. Also, there was a new project or library, or how to say that, it's called YARP. And it's a shortcut for yet another reverse proxy. And at .NET Conf there was a session about modernizing old ASP.NET applications using YARP. The idea, YARP is a very fast reverse proxy that can process incoming traffic, and based on some rules it can send the traffic to another endpoint. And basically what you can do if you are trying to modernize some really old, some really big application which cannot be rewritten in a single week or something like that. So you can use YARP and set up rules that will route the traffic to the old app or to the new application. So basically you will start working on the new version of the application using the most modern stuff, .NET 7 and all the libraries, all the frameworks, maybe .VVM, it depends what you need. And you can have these 2 applications running next to each other, and you can, if the new application already implements some part of the functionality of the old app, you can just redirect HTTP traffic to the new application. There are several things you will need to solve, like both applications would probably work with the same database, so there can be some concurrency issues, transactions locking and things like that. Hopefully it will not be a big issue. You should be able to somehow make a common authentication between these 2 versions, maybe using some external identity provider or something like that, or you will need to implement some cross authentication, so the HTTP request would contain like 2 cookies, one for the old app, one for the new application as well. If the application is using session, you would probably need to share this session somehow. There can also be several problems because like the objects are serialized when they go to session, and binary serialization is not the same on old .NET, and maybe on the new .NET it doesn't even exist. I don't really know, I haven't used it for years. So maybe you will need to serialize the objects in the session in some other way, maybe JSON or something like that. Or also if the application is using caching, then you would probably need to invalidate or synchronize these caches on both endpoints, so you will be sure that they contain the same data, that you will not have any conflicts. This is a possible way, and it can be very useful if the new application is really different from the old application, so you can just redirect for some parts of the application, and maybe you don't need even to modernize all the entire application. You can keep less frequently used places forever as the old app and just route the new traffic for new parts in the new version of the app. And in .vvm we have also a second way of modernization which can be also useful to know about. So if you have, for example, a web forms application, .vvm still supports the OWin hosting and .NET framework. So if you upgrade your web forms application to at least .NET 4.7.2, which should also, it can make some problems, but it should not be that complicated, then you can install OWin NuGet package .vvm.owin NuGet, and you can do basically the same reverse proxying but within the single process. So this in this box, it's just one application, one process. So it should be much easier to access the session, access the shared data, call the common code, because you are running in the same process. The data exchange between the new parts and the old parts would be much easier. And of course, the goal in that case would be to get rid of all dependencies on the old .NET framework, which means typically rewriting ASPX pages to some other framework, for example .vvm if you are using it for this modernization, and refactor the code behind for ASPX pages to C# view models, which is not that difficult. It's quite a small change unless the ASPX page contains a lot of JavaScript. Then the migration process is not that difficult. And once you get rid of all dependencies, you can just switch the project to .NET 7. You will just change this .vvm.owin package with .vvm.ASP.NET Core package and change the target framework, clean up the CS proj, because on new .NET the CS proj is much more simple, much shorter, and then maybe fix several things in the startup because the authentication libraries are a bit different, and that should be it. So that's what you can use. So you can decide if you want to make the reverse proxy out of the process with YARP or in the process with using .vvm as a new target technology for the old ASPX pages. Here is a short table which will tell you what you need to do if you want to start. So with YARP you need to create a project for the new application, deploy YARP, and then deploy the new application, set up the cross authentication, and if the application is using caching or session, you should deal with that sometimes. Maybe you will not need to, they can be separate, but sometimes there will have to be some synchronization. So you should at least evaluate if it's necessary to synchronize these things and share these things, or if you will use some other solution in the new application. If you prefer using .vvm, you will just install NuGet package in the same project. You don't need to deploy anything at the beginning. The deployment will change at the end. Then the incremental modernization is practically the same. You just will take parts of the old application and you have to rewrite it to some newer technology. With YARP, you can choose any framework you want, either client-side, either server-side. So it can be Blazor, it can be React, it can be Vue.js, everything what is modern today. Or it can be .vvm if you like the MVVM approach for building web apps. It's up to you. If in the .vvm in-process modernization, of course, you need to rewrite to .vvm, because this is the common point between the old .NET and new .NET. The syntax of .vvm is same, no matter what the target framework is. If you want to share existing business logic, if you have two apps, you need to move the code to a class library, which shouldn't be that big deal. In .vvm, you are still in the same app, in the same project, so you don't need to do anything. Then when it comes to using the new features of .NET in case of YARP, you can use the new .NET features immediately in the new application. It should be based on the newest .NET with newest library, so you should be able to use all the goodies. In .vvm case, you should be quite careful. There are some C# language features that will work even with .NET Framework, but of course a lot of new API is only on the new .NET. So you will be able to use the new language and .NET features only after the migration is complete. And which method is good for which case? Here is just my subjective opinion. If you just need to rewrite the application to be able to use .NET 7, but the UI should not change a lot, then I would prefer using .VVM, because a lot of components in .VVM are very similar to the web forms one, so the migration should be not exactly one-to-one, but it will be quite close to that. If the new application will look completely different, if it should support a lot of new scenarios, if it's a lot different from the old one, you can just, I would prefer using YARP, because it gives you more freedom. You can hit a lot of restriction if you would still be working in the .NET framework. For the new parts, you will be able to use .NET 7 now. So it's about the differences between the application. Sometimes with YARP you don't need to have just 2 applications. You can have 3, 4, 5. If you split this big monolithic old application into several smaller ones, YARP will be able to handle it. You will just add another endpoints, another targets. So this is a comparison. You have 2 ways and you can choose the way which is better for your exact scenario. So that's for the modernization. And let's see some news we are preparing in .vvm 4.1. For those of you who didn't see .vvm, I have just a very short demo of how model view model experience for web apps work. So this is a sample project. You can see in .vvm it's standard. I have .NET 6, I could upgrade it to .NET 7, but the project template in the Visual Studio extension is still for .NET 6. We will be releasing a new version soon. And it's just a standard ASP.NET Core app. It just references few NuGet packages, .vvm ASP.NET Core, and Hot Reload, which provides a similar experience like you are used to from Blazor or from something like that. And every page has a view and a view model. So this is my view. It's just HTML syntax with few extensions. We have our own components, which you can recognize by this prefix. So we have a text box. So I'm binding some number 1. And it's just a data binding to the view model. And in my view model, I have number 1, number 2, and result properties. Yeah. So I'm just using components and binding properties from the view model to the components. So first text box, second text box, and here I'm printing out the result value. And when I need to implement some kind of business logic, I'm writing that as a command in the view model. So for example, here I have a method called calculate, which will take these numbers and produce the result. This method just takes the view model and changes it somehow. And because this is running on the server, I can access database here, so I can use my DB context, I can do anything I need, I can call any kind of .NET code. And .vvm will just take this view model and make it available on the client, so I can have a button which will just call this calculate method. And also .vvm has a second way of doing things, which is called static command. Sorry, I have an issue in this sample. And if it's a static command, it means that .vvm will try to translate this C# code into JavaScript. So I can add 2 numbers together without calling the server, without invoking any HTTP request, but just by this translation. It's not that powerful as WebAssembly in Blazor. It will be maybe in the future, we will see. But right now we can translate a lot of things that you will be doing to your view models. If I run this application, it should be quite simple. So you have components and you have a data binding, 2-way data binding. So when I write something in the text box, it will be written in the property of the view model. And when I click on this, the calculate method will be called and the changes in the view model will be sent back to the browser. This doesn't reload the entire page. .vvm has a JavaScript part, quite big JavaScript part, a lot of code, which will just take the view model, send it to the server, call the function, and then apply the results to the page. If I do the same thing, this will do the same thing, just without communication with the server. So that's the basic principle of .vvm. If you haven't seen .vvm yet, go to .vvm.com and download an extension for Visual Studio, and we also have Visual Studio Code extension, so you can also get the new VS Code extension, which you will see in a couple of minutes. And you can then just go File, New Project, search for .vvm and create a .vvm project, and you can try all these things. So what I would like to show, recently in March we have announced 4th version of .vvm, so we have .vvm 4.0, and there were several new things. We have finally we stopped supporting Internet Explorer 11. You can see that IE is a very old browser, but we were trying to keep support for that as long as possible. However, now we decided to cut this browser off because it was very difficult to maintain .vvm working for IE 11, and it's not even supported now. So, like, sorry if you still depend on this browser, we cannot help you. You can stay on old .vvm. Also, we have lifted the minimum target frameworks. So in .vvm 4.0, you can use .NET Core 3.1 or newer, of course, and also the all.NET Framework 4.7.2. Yeah, so that's how .vvm can still be installed in old web forms projects. Even if you don't plan to modernize, you can just use .vvm to build new pages easily and more conveniently than in web forms. .vvm 4.0 introduced several new features like composite controls, a new nice functional way how you can build components. It provides Roslyn analyzers, which will show you warning if you are doing something in your view model which you should not. And one of the best features I really like is that you can host external components in .vvm pages. Because .vvm has components for a lot of things, but we don't have everything, and for the community and for all the projects it's necessary, so you will be able to do everything you want with .vvm. And that's, for example, one of the ways how to achieve that is to be able to use third-party React components. We are also working on support for other frameworks. We have a prototype of Svelte integration, and the integration bridge is quite generic, so it should be able to support even other frameworks. So composite controls, if you are interested in how that looks like, it's just a control which implements this method, and it has some inputs. So this is what the user can set to the control. So the user can see like progress, value equals something. Here we have a nice type value or binding, which means that the control can accept either a value like this, text equals calculate, or a binding, which means like text equals some data binding for the view model. So value or binding means you can use both of these things here, and then we are just returning what the control should produce. So we are returning HTML generic control, which is just the div element with some class and with some data attribute, and this will use some kind of magic which will decide if it's a value, it will print the value there as a attribute value. If it's a binding, it will translate it to JavaScript, so it could be evaluated on the client. That's what the framework will do for you. So it's easy to write components like that, compose components from other components. And we have a support for the React and other frameworks because, for example, in .vvm we don't have any ready-made chart controls. So basically you can use React component recharts, which I will show in a few seconds, and you can pass some view values from the view model and respond to events. So if the user selects something in the control, you can like for example, write it to your view model. Right now we are supporting React, and we are also supporting Svelte. There's a question in the chat. What are the pros and cons when using MVVM and MVC for web apps? It's quite a long discussion, but it's about, for me, MVC is great for, I would say, but take it as my subjective opinion. MVC is great for like public-facing websites, which more focus on presenting data than like doing some kind of complicated UI with a lot of form fields. When I was trying to make some complicated forms with maybe hundreds of components like text boxes, drop-down lists, things like that, or some dynamic lists where you can add or remove things, it was quite difficult to do in MVC when the form was not static, when it was dynamic, like you fill some value in some form field and the rest of the form will change. These state changes are easier, at least for me, to cover with MVVM. I have MVVM view model which will represent the state of this complicated and dynamically changing form, and then I will use two-way data binding to bind it to the user interface. Yeah. So if I am building some line of business application with a lot of grids, a lot of complicated forms with these things, then I would prefer MVVM. But if I would be doing like, I don't know, public-facing website for searching airplane tickets where you have forms, but they have like 5 fields and you just get the values from the user and then you present a lot of options, then I would use MVC or something easier, because I really don't need two-way data binding in that, because I'm just binding the data one way. Yeah, I have the list of the objects representing the airplane tickets and or the airline choices, and then I will render UI from that. But the user is not adding their own tickets or manipulating with the list. The user is just browsing. So if the application interacts with the user two-way, like gathers a lot of data with the user and based on that it's providing another information, then MVVM would work better for me. Yeah. So it depends what you are building, and because we are on ASP.NET Core, you can use both technologies in the same app. You can just, in your startup, you can register .vvm and you can register MVC or any other, or Blazor, or just REST APIs, or just SignalR, because .vvm also stands on top of the ASP.NET Core pipeline. So you can combine these technologies, and if your application has 2 parts, you can decide and you can do one part in one technology and second part in the other technology, and you can use the same CSS styles, so the users will even not notice the difference. Like, look, their admin section which looks the same as the front and side of the website, but it's written in some other technology, but the users doesn't even know about that. So that's the question. Thanks for the question. Actually, if you have any other questions, just feel free to ask in the chat. I will be happy to answer. Let's go back to the React integration. So you have the view model, you have .vvm components, and if you want to use external control in the page, you can register a React component and pass the data from the view model to this control and respond to events which are happening in the control. So I have a demo for that. So let's first see the app in action. So I have this lovely trivial application. I'm not good in graphics, that's why it doesn't look so great, but here I will just ask the user to provide some city, and when I click on get weather, it will show a chart of the lowest and highest temperature. So you can see it's in Celsius, by the way, so you can see it's not very hot here in Prague, Czech Republic. And when I change to other city, you can see the chart is dynamically changing because like it gets new data. So let's see how this works. First, let's see the MVVM side of the of the thing. So I have a text box with this city. It's bound to a city property in the view model, and here is a function getWeather, which can be async, and I'm just using some weather service which gets here by using this dependency injection. So same as in MVC or other technology, you can inject your services in the view models. And so I will first try to find the city and then get weather for the city. And the result is just a list of some objects. Yeah. And I will pass it to the weather forecast property. And it's a property in my view model. So I have the city and the list of weather data. Weather data contains just date, some text representation for the user, and minimum temperature, maximum temperature. So I will get an array with like 7 items for each day or something like that. So that's very nice C# code. You can write unit tests for that to be sure, or integration tests to be sure that this will work. User will set the city, then you will call getWeather, and here will appear the results for that. So that's what you can do. And in the page, also I have this favorite cities, which is doing the same thing. I will just say assign Brno to the city and call getWeather. Yeah, so things like that. And here I have a bar chart control from the namespace JS, and it's a React component. And it will just get this weather forecast, which is a list of objects. So this will be the data passed to the control. And I'm also customizing it somehow. So I'm saying use date display text in this array as a property that will be labeled for the x-axis. And on the series, show these two properties, min temperature and max temperature, and use these colors for them. And if the user clicks on a series, I will take the name of the series, name of this property, and put it in the selected series view model here. Okay, so that's what you can do. And how this React control looks like. I have my module, which is here. I'm using TypeScript, so the extension of this file is TSX. And I'm using ESBuild, which is a very nice library for like converting this TypeScript experiences to JavaScript. So it will produce nice ECMAScript module with compiled these things. And basically I'm importing two things. I'm importing bar chart wrapper, which is my React control, and I'm using this .vvm JS component React package, which is the integration bridge between .vvm and React. So let's look at the control first. You can see it's a function that gets this props object, and this props object will contain everything I have set in this markup. So it will like contain data with this array of items. It will contain X label, series names, series colors, and things like that. So this props object will contain this. And I'm returning a React component from a recharts React library. I've imported this recharts package, and I'm just returning a React control. And I have just take the data from props and put it here using data key, this X label, and for the series I'm just generating these bar objects for each of the series. So I'm just taking the series names, splitting by comma, and from each series, like from this min temperature and max temperature, I'm just generating show a bar for that particular series with this color. And when you click on that, call this series click function with the series name parameter, which I will get here. So you can write a wrapper on the React control like this, and that's what creates the chart. And when the data in the view model changes, when the getWeather will replace the collection with some new collection, thanks to the two-way data binding, these changes will propagate to this React control. So the React control will get that, and it will render that animation that will create this nice transition. So you can see like the chart is just adjusting and changing, and then there is the animation. in the view model, I've just changed the values in the array. That's it. And when I click on some Siri, you can see it appears here because I'm calling this function Siri click and passing the Siri name. So you can see I'm just providing a lambda, I'm getting Siri name, and I will assign it to root selected Siri, and it will appear here. I have other questions in the chat. If there is a course or video about .vvm, like a crash course, I have few recommendations for you. If you go to .vvm.com/docs, there is a documentation. We try to make it, have it up to date, so you can read some introduction. There is also quick start section, or you can just go through this thing. Also, here is a link to videos which should redirect you to our YouTube channel. We have some tutorials there. Some of them are a bit older, but if you have been working with any other .NET framework, .NET Web framework like Web Forms or WinForms or WPF, you will see that the components in .vvm are pretty much the same or very similar, so I think that you will be able to learn the concepts quite quickly. So that's and we will be publishing these demo apps. If you want to try them, I will at the end of this session I will post the link in the chat. It will be quite easy to find. So that's the React integration. If .vvm doesn't have a control that would work for your scenario, you can find any React control and you can just wrap it like that. The only problematic part is to set up the compilation of TypeScript, so it will produce the JavaScript version of the package, but it's not that difficult problem. So once you get it, and you can copy paste it from the demo, I will send the link to the chat after I finish speaking. Okay. So what's we are preparing for .vvm 4.1, because the React integration is already part of .vvm 4.0, so you can use it right away. We plan to release .vvm 4.1 by the end of this year, so stay tuned. We have already published a lot of public preview. I think now we have preview 14, so there will be few more public previews, and then you can expect the final stable version. And there are several new features. One of them is my favorite. It's Auto UI, which allows you to auto-generate user interface like grids and forms from your data model, which you have to decorate by attributes. Also, my colleagues will be showing the new types in view models, and also you can, if you are building your own controls using a kind of control which is called markup control, you can declare properties there. It looks like a tiny feature, but if you start using .vvm, you will probably find that you will need to build a lot of user controls, and this is simplifying your life as a developer. Also, we have some commercial products. If you want to be productive with .vvm, you can look on our website. We have we are preparing wrappers for Bootstrap 5, because we rewritten the entire library to use the composite control approach I was showing a few minutes ago. So you can check that out. Right now we still have Bootstrap 3 and 4 covered, but Bootstrap 5 will be also released. We hope that we will be able to release it together with .vvm 4.1. So let's look at Auto UI. That's my last demo for this session. Then there will be a break, and after that my colleagues will show other features of .vvm. So previously we had a library called .vvm Dynamic Data. It is still available even for .vvm 4.1, but if you have been using that, you maybe found some problems like performance, because it wasn't compile time generated. It was generating the UI, calling a lot of reflection on every request, so it wasn't very efficient. For smaller scenarios it was fine, but for bigger applications we had several problems with that. So if you are using this library, try to migrate to Auto UI, but if you don't migrate, no problem. We will be publishing .vvm Dynamic Data, but it will not get new features. So it's not obsolete yet. It will be at some point probably, but until it doesn't generate a lot of maintenance work for the team, we will be just publishing the packages with every version of .vvm. And Auto UI is a new version. It has more features and it's much faster. So what it can do for you, it can generate forms. So if you have an object with a lot of properties, it can generate a user interface for editing this object. It can generate grid views. So you just put a collection of items to the grid view and say auto generate columns, and it will do it for you. And it's quite clever. So if it's a Boolean column, it will render a checkbox in the cell. If it's some number, you can provide a format string and things like that. And you can also add your own custom columns at the beginning, at the end, or wherever you want. Probably we will be adding some other things for generating some other lists. For example, today it's very popular to present items as cards, and it can be responsive. So if you have small display, it's just a few cards below each other. If it's a big screen, you have 3-4 columns, something like that. So maybe we will be also doing some kind of list interfaces and things like that. However, now we can do forms and grid views. How it works? You have a C# object which has all the properties of the object you want to edit, and you can use data annotations attribute to provide metadata for the form generator. So it's same as in other technologies you have probably seen. There is some dynamic UI in MVC or dynamic data in ASP.NET Web Forms, so the principles are the same. Let's dig in the code because it's better than in the slides. So here I have a model object, for example, my profile model. So for the my profile screen, I want the user to be able to select the first name, to enter the last name, and to select some location preferences, for example. And each of the properties has some metadata. So for example, I say that what should be displayed as a name of the field is this first space name. Yeah. And you can also use resources. So there is a way how you can put it to a resource file. So you say resource type equals type of your resource file and things like that. And it will search for the localized entries in this resource file. There is also validation, so this is not part of Auto UI, but you can use that in .vvm2. It's the standard required attribute with some error message. Again, it can be customized by localized by using resources. Here, for example, I have another class which I have also decorated. For example, in a model for a meetup object, I have an ID property. I need it there, but I don't want it to be shown. So I say display auto generate field equals false. And for example, here I have a description, which is also text box, but it should be bigger because probably the user will enter multiple lines in that. So I'm saying data type equals multi-line text. And also when I'm rendering a grid list of meetups, I don't want descriptions to be there, so I'm saying this field is visible only in the edit mode, not in the list mode. Let's look at the app. It's called Meetup Manager. Again, I'm not a graphic, so I'm just using pure Bootstrap, nothing special. It doesn't look very nice, and it's also the pictures here are not very well scaled, but like as I said, I don't know graphics. So you can see I'm displaying event name, some event image, start time, end time, in which country it's that, and on which place it's occurring. And when I go to the edit mode, there are more fields. There is the event description, because it's bound to the same object, but I'm using this visible attribute to tell, okay, this field will be visible only in the edit mode. Then there is the image. Here I have the data type. I can also specify display format for the dates and things like that. So that's it. And you can see I have also selection here. So here is a Czech Republic, and here is a list of countries. I didn't include all of them, just only some, but for the purpose of demo, it's fine. And you can see that this is cascading actually. So when I select another country, like Germany, this location will change because in Germany there are different locations than in the Czech Republic. Yeah, so these are basically cascading drop-down lists, but I can do them with using Auto UI as well. Because if you look at this property country ID, I have marked it with the attribute called selection. And this attribute tells that this is not an integer field where user would just enter some number like 15 or something like that, but it will be selector. And as an identification of from which items I'm selecting, I'm using this type. This type is a record, and it needs to inherit from selection, which is a type provided by DotVVM Auto UI, and as a key, primary key for this item, it's integer. Yeah? So this type has to be same as this type, and basically the selection type has two fields like display name and this value. So basically it's just a name value object, and I have implemented this interface iSelectionProvider of country selection, and it's a class which when .vvm needs the items for the selector, this class will provide them. So I have implemented for this selector, I have implemented this service, which whenever the items are needed, like it will call this method and I will provide a list of country selection. So I'm just looking in the database and listing all the countries, building these country selection objects, value it's the ID, and display name is the name of the country. And that's how .vvm will get these items for this list. And the location is done in a similar way. So I have a location ID, and you can see I'm using location by country selection. And location by country selection is also selection of integer, but here it implements a different kind of service. iSelectionProvider, location by country selection, and there is also second parameter, which is int, nullable int. Basically, it will be the country in which I will be searching for the locations. Yeah? So you can see here is the getSelectorItems method with the country ID argument, and if there is no country provided, I will return empty list because like the user didn't select the first value, so I cannot show the second values. And when the ID is specified, I will just be using locations but filtering to the particular country. And again, I'm building these objects and returning a list of the items. And that is how dynamic data will be able to work with that. The only thing I need to do in my view model is meetup detail view model. For every selection, I need to include this child object in my view model. So for example, in this meetup detail view model, which is the view model for this page, I need to have selection view model of countries and selection view model of location by country. And I need to initialize that. When I'm initializing these locations, I'm telling where to find this int parameter with current country. So I'm passing a lambda to this constructor to tell when you need the locations, evaluate this lambda, that will give you the country ID, and based on that, call the method to get the list of items. So you can have parameterized selections by that, and that's how you can make these text boxes. And if you look at the markup of the page, it's quite easy because the entire form is done like this. I have this auto bootstrap form, which is a form which will be using bootstrap CSS classes. And I'm just passing this meetup object to the form. I'm saying the view name is edit, which means that these visible edit fields will be included. And I'm not using validation here. and I want to generate fields for the properties title, description, and image URL. And image URL is a string, but it's a special kind of string because it's not, I don't want the user to put their URL for the image. I want the user to be able to upload the image. So I'm providing my own editor template for the field image URL. And I'm using file upload component, which is part of .vvm, and it will just allow the user to upload one or more files, and I will like do some processing of the image, so I will resize it to some smaller things. And I'm also rendering a thumbnail, so you can see this is part of the auto-generated form, but I have provided my own editing UI because I want to customize the field. So you don't need to be worried about that. Once you use Auto UI, you will not be flexible enough and you will be locked to some particular way of generating UI. You will be able to do it as you need because this is pretty extensible. Here I have, you can see I have two fields on the same row. I can just render my own bootstrap row, bootstrap column, and I see I need a form just for one property. Yeah, so I will select which property will be in the left column, which will be in the right column. And what's next? I can specify conventions. So if you are following some naming conventions, for example, all properties which represent image URLs, its name will end with image URL. You can register a convention that for every property which name ends with image URL, I will be setting some kind of attribute. In this case, I'm setting UI hint, and it's because I have written my own type of the field, image grid column provider, which will generate image element in my grid view, or if the image is not specified, I will render some div with class image none, which will provide some kind of placeholder experience for me. Yeah, so here, this is my custom column, and it's used because of the convention. If the property name ends with image URL, then I will be able to use this field for the column. So it's extensible, and you can do things like that. I have been showing selection. Just one last thing. The selection works also with collections. So if I have some number of locations and I want the user to specify multiple locations, which are his favorite or their favorite, then I can have list of integers in my view model. And if I go to my profile, I can select several locations and I will get list of their IDs directly in my view model using two-way data binding. So I will just have this collection of integers in my view model, and I can just save it to the database or do whatever I want with that. There are some questions in the chat. Can this be done with Blazor as well? Actually, I don't know if Blazor has some kind of library or framework like that, but of course you can write it yourself. You can look how it's done in .vvm, and you can maybe like change some parts of the UI generation to do the same thing in Blazor. So that's definitely what you can do. This could also be done by maybe source generators, or it depends. Like you can for sure do it. On the other hand, you want to make it cleverly, because if you would use reflection to scan for the properties for every request, and if you would be generating this in the runtime, the app would be quite slow. Okay, thanks for the clarification. The Blazor question was according to React components. I'm not aware of the way how to use React components in Blazor. Probably it would be possible to do something like that, but I don't know. You can use iframe in the worst case, yeah, which will work. But basically, all the React integration depends on like several things. First, you need to make some part of the page that will be maintained by React and not by Blazor, because Blazor is manipulating with the HTML elements in the page. So you need some place in the page where you would say, okay, Blazor, please don't touch this. This is a React generated thing. So like I will be maintaining it on my own. And then you need just some way to pass data to the React component and back from that. And do you always have to write properties I want to generate? No, you don't have to. If you don't write explicitly the list of properties, like I'm doing, for example, here in this account, my profile, I'm just saying this is the simplest case, bootstrap form, data context, and that's it. Then it will use the order of properties, which is specified here, or there is like order property in the display attribute. So if you override that, it will change the priorities of these properties. So that's what you can do. And basically that's it. Or you can use this visible attribute to render some part of the forms. So it's up to you if you explicitly write the properties. If you explicitly list them, it's good that if somebody adds a property here, it will not break your UI. But on the other hand, the editor for that property might be missing. So you need to choose what you exactly want. Okay, so that's what you can do. You can specify the conventions. You can use localization because the attributes can reference resource items. And if you want to render editor for just one property, you can say auto editor property equals what property you are doing. There is some built-in logic, and you can implement your own rules for from this property of this type. I will generate this kind of UI. You can use this form, either just pure form, auto form, and you will CSS style it as you want, or you can do auto bootstrap form, which will use the bootstrap CSS classes. For grids, I haven't shown how the syntax looks for grids, so that's the last thing. In meetup list, you can see I'm using grid view. I'm binding it to collection of meetups, and here I have auto grid view columns, which will generate all the columns for that object in the grid view. And I'm also adding my custom columns for editing and removing this kind of meetup, or this row, for example. So that's it, and that's everything from me. So now we will have 10 minutes break, and after that there will be my colleagues showing the extension for Visual Studio Code, which is new, which new version we have recently published, and also using the new data types in .vvm. So stay tuned, and we will be back in 10 minutes.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the stream. My name is Andrei and I'm one of the DotVVM developers, and today I'll be talking to you about some new features that will be coming along in the upcoming version DotVVM 4.1. These features will be about the serialization part of the framework. But before I start with that, I would like to first show you a link to the repository that Tomáš mentioned, because for some reason it's probably not showing up in the chat. So everybody who would like to see the examples that Tomáš showed in his talk, you can visit the github.com/riganti/.vvm-kiosk, and you can see all the examples that Tomáš showed. This is basically our repository that we recently used to create some new examples for .vvm. But yeah, right now let's get back to my presentation. So as I was telling you, I'll be speaking about some new features in .vvm serialization. So yeah, let's start with that. And the first thing that I would like to talk to you about is the date and time enhancements. So what do we mean by this? In .NET 6, the .NET team basically introduced two new types alongside with many other interesting features. And they also introduced these date-only and time-only types, which is a great addition to the commonly known type for handling dates and times in .NET, which was, of course, as everybody knows, the datetime struct. And these new types, date only and time only, basically allow you to work with time and date in a more granular way. So in datetime, basically you always had to put information about both the date and the time part, and it was also tightly together with a specific time zone, for example. But right now you can leverage these types such as date only, which is used only for basically storing stuff like years, months, and days, and also the time only, which is supposed to be used for storing only the time part of the date time. This is very, very handy, because if you think about it, the date only can be used for storing stuff like birthdays, because it's only a specific date. We do not really care about the time part nor the time zone part. It doesn't really change or isn't really supposed to alter it in any way. And similarly to that, the time only struct can be also very useful, because it can be used to store stuff like recurring time events. So for example, your alarm clock time and stuff like that. So these are really useful, as I'm sure many developers would agree that had the pleasure of implementing some system that highly depended on date times and had to work around all that mess with different time zones and stuff like that. This, in my opinion, brings a little like small clearance to the all the stuff. So you can basically distinguish whether you really need the whole date time struct or just can do with these smaller types. And the best thing about this is, in connection with .vvm, we will be actually introducing the support for this in .vvm 4.1. Actually, if you are keen in trying preview versions, you can basically try it for yourselves even now. And as always, if you are more interested in this problematic, there is a really great blog post by Microsoft where you can read way more about this, why it was introduced, why this so powerful, and also some other stuffs like, for example, considering different libraries for handling time and stuff like that. But yeah, the main feature is basically the date only and time only, and since .vvm 4.1 you'll be able to use it in your .vvm applications as well. So let me show you a quick example of that. So I have a really simple page. Let's start with its view model though. In the view model you can see there are only two properties. The first is the date only property, which is set to the current date, and time only property, which is set to like something like an hour ago or something like that. So as you can see, we have in view model only these two properties. These were previously not really supported, but since .vvm 4.1 they are supported and basically have this first class citizens, because not only we support their serialization, we also support formatting and really all the stuff that you would expect from regular supported .vvm primitives. So the page is also pretty simple. I'll be just rendering these properties multiple times, once only in a simple span. Then I'll be rendering them in a text box, and for the third time I will also render them in a text box, but this time I'll be using these browser provided types for text box. So let's see how it looks. As you can see, this is a pretty simple demo, something that we use for testing our framework internally. So as you can see, dates and times are displayed properly. Since this is bound to a view model, I can always change something and it propagates to all these different fields. So yeah, this is just a small demonstration that this works, and since .vvm 4.1 you will be able to use these features also in your applications. So yeah, this is the first the smaller feature that I wanted to talk to you about, but now I would like to show you something a bit more interesting, something I think a lot of people will be using definitely in their applications. And the next thing that I would like to talk to you about are different structures like records, regular structures, and even record structs. So these are different concepts, and since .vvm 4.1 they'll be also supported by the framework. So just to briefly go over what this stuff actually means. So records are really useful and were introduced in .NET 5. We're more like a C#9 because it's more of a compiler feature, but they basically allow us to easily define new objects that have value-based equality and have many great features that were synthesized by the compiler. So for example, since they have this value-based equality, they are not compared based on references, instead they are compared based on the provided properties, and this is something that was implemented by the compiler since it overrides the equals method, the get_hashcode method, but it also overrides stuff like toString, so that it provides a nice default way to basically showcase all the properties which are the part of the record. And most importantly for us, it provides also a primary constructor whose parameters are matching individual properties. And why is this important? Because this is the common requirement that also have many other serialization frameworks and that we are leveraging as well. So Since .vvm 4.1, if you will be using either reference types or value types, such as classes, records, regular structs, or even record structs, and you'll have these constructors whose parameters names match your properties, you'll be able to use these types also in your view model, because now .vvm has also this routine to basically its serialization part to work also and construct these types based on non-default constructors. So this is the very important part. So since version 4.1, you'll be able to use also these types, which in my opinion is pretty interesting, and I'll quickly show you why on a sample that I prepared. Okay, sorry, this is the wrong screen. Yeah, so I'll be showing you a very simple page where there will be just a simple grid that will be displaying customers and some of their properties. But what is way more important is how this is represented in the view model. So let's look at that. So if we take a look first at the customer, we can see that it's a regular record. And we can also see that it's really a concise way on how to construct, for example, DTOs, and really like any simple objects that is just supposed to hold some information. So as you can see, the customer is implemented in this way. It contains a property which is of type customer ID, which is a record struct, which is also a new feature that was added, I think, in C#10. And one of its properties is a regular struct, which contains two properties. And as I already told you, a primary constructor that whose names basically whose parameter names can be directly mapped to its individual properties. That's why this can be easily understood by the .vvm serialization framework. So as we already know, these customers are now leveraging records. They are leveraging record structs and even regular structs. So, but other than that, you can basically use it as a regular grid like you are normally used to. Really simple sample that just loads a fake collection of customers, sets it into a grid, and then we'll display them. So I'll just show you very quickly that it works. So I'll go to the second part of this solution, and as you can see, these customers are displayed here just as they were defined in my source code. And we are leveraging these new constructs that you can use, such as records, record structs, and even regular structs. This customer ID, which I provided here, will be a very important concept in the next example that I'll be showing you. But also where we will make it a little more powerful, but I feel like also this example brings a lot of new stuff into .vvm already, because you can also for example use something like a dependency injection and like construct more complex stuff with more complex constructors, which was not supported, or not fully at least supported, in the previous version. So since version 4.1, this will all be support it, and you can use regular records, record structs, classes. It's up to you what serves best your use case. Will be basically just there for you to use it. So this was the second example where we were talking about different structures that were introduced in either .NET 5 or .NET 6, I think, and we also will be introducing the support for this in .VVM 4.1. And the third, and I think maybe even the most interesting stuff that will be coming along in .VVM 4.1 in regards to serialization is a way to define a custom value types. So so far I showed you two examples. In the first example, we basically added support for new types. Those were date only and time only. And we basically provided first-class support for them by providing a custom serialization routines, providing support for custom formatting and stuff like that. In the second example, I showed you that you can now use even more custom types, so you can leverage records, record structs, stuff like that. But now I would like to show you how to take it one step further and basically create a custom type, but also provide it with a custom semantics for .vvm. So what do I mean by that? You can basically create a type which gets a special annotation so that we can understand it, that will tell us how to interpret that type on client side. So it will basically allow you to define a type that will behave one way on server. Internally, it will be based on an already supported primitive type, and this primitive type will be used on client and also in the communication between the client and the server. So this may sound a bit confusing, but I'll show you an example in a few seconds. But first, I would like to show or tell you why this is important or what it can bring us. And one of the most important use cases that we thought of until now is the support for strongly typed IDs. So in case you are not familiar with the concept, strongly typed IDs are there to help you write a more type-safe code. So IDs is a general concept, and basically every programmer works with IDs every day. IDs can be of type either integer, string, GUID, or maybe something like a even native handle and stuff like that. But what do these types have in common is that these types are really general. Like you can have an integer and mean something completely different as compared to an integer ID. Although when you look at the code, it basically has the same structure, and this is something that we would like to change. So the concept of strongly typed IDs is that you would provide a very thin layer over your actual ID, be it GUID, integer, or whatever, and you would be passing these strongly typed classes instead of that primitive type. This has many advantages, because if you think about it, there are a lot of methods, for example, that accept strings, integers, GUIDs, and types like that, but you can mistakenly basically provide there a value that was not supposed to be there because it expected, for example, only a specific ID. And even these IDs, like if you are using only GUIDs, a specific GUID can mean something different in one context and completely something different, like nothing at all in a different context. So this is why we would like to make this code a bit more clean by providing, for example, these strongly typed IDs. And this is a feature, the only feature that I'm showing you today that is not available yet for trying in one of our preview builds. It will be available in .vvm 4.1 in one of the upcoming preview builds, and of course in the final build of the 4.1. But right now it's still as a pull request because some small changes are there to be made yet, but other than that it's basically already working nice, and I'll be very briefly showing it to you on this presentation. So let's go back to the Visual Studio. This time I'll be showing you a different project. All right, so let me zoom it in a way that it can be better fitted to camera. Okay, so how to define a custom primitive type. So right now on my screen you can see one of these custom primitive types. You can basically distinguish them by this attribute. It will be a new attribute. It will be added to .vvm 4.1 that basically says that this sample ID is a custom primitive type. And this custom primitive type uses internally nullable GUID. So this is the use case where user wanted to use nullable GUIDs as their IDs, but wanted to make it a little more type safe. That's why the sample ID record was introduced. And the second parameter is a converter. This converter is needed for us to facilitate stuff like parsing the sample IDs from objects. So for example, if we are providing you values from route parameters or query parameters, this is basically the type converter that will be used. But it's basically really simple. It just has one method that you need to implement. And for example, in this use case, you can see that, of course, it takes an object, and if it's a string, basically we can convert it to GUID pretty easily. GUID has a constructor that takes a string. If it's already a GUID, then yeah, it's pretty simple, just return it. And if it's something else, since this is a nullable, either return null, or if it was something completely different, like throw an exception, because this shouldn't happen at all. So this converter is, as I think, pretty simple. And the last thing that you need to do is to provide also a JSON converter, because this is the converter that will be used when communicating between server and client, so that we know how to serialize your classes when they go to client. So as I already told you, there is a underlying type, which in this case is nullable GUID, and this means that whenever instances of sample ID in this case are sent to client, they will be serialized as nullable GUIDs. And this is also the representation that will be used on the client. However, on the server, you have basically the advantage of using this strongly typed ID. So as you can see here in ViewModel, you can basically create properties that should be filled from either route or query. You can also use this together with validation. So you can provide the required attribute so that whenever this is, for example, null, you would get a validation exception. And yeah, you can also use it in static command without any issues whatsoever, both when providing arguments and when providing return values. As you can see, the argument is here, and the return value I'll show you in a second on the .html page. And of course, it can also work with regular commands together, as I already said, with validation. So yeah, route parameters, query parameters, validation, command, regular commands, static commands, everything that you would basically expect from this feature already works. So I think this is very, very interesting and will be, of course, released in the .vvm 4.1 as well. And yeah, one more interesting thing, you can also use it, as I showed you. There was this collection of these typed IDs. You can basically use them also in a combo box that I'll show you in a second. And yeah, we already know that it works well with validation, or at least you need to believe me, but I'll show you it in a second. And yeah, it also works with static command, as I promised. Here is a static command that is calling using a instance of the sample ID, and the result, which is also a sample ID, will be stored in this property. So just to show you that it works, this is since this is still a little work in progress, I'll be showing you this on our internal demos. So as I told you, there is a combo box, and if I scroll up a little, sorry, wrong file, then you can see that these elements, these three elements, will be showing up here. So if I select, for example, the first one, you can basically see that the GUID is the same. I can even try to call a command that in this case will fail because this field was not yet selected and it needs to be not null. So yeah, let's select something. Now it passes. There are no problems whatsoever. And also, for example, the static command result, you can see it right here. The sample is pretty simple, but it shows that it's already working. And the most important part is that you can basically implement or create these custom value types only using these two attributes. So there is no additional work needed, and these attributes, or I mean mainly the custom primitive type attribute in .vvm case, is pretty powerful. So these are the custom value types. There is one more thing that you might need, but that is relevant only if you want to directly display these custom value types like this. So just basically in this case, .vvm would need to call your toString method, and this needs to be implemented. So but this is also pretty simple because you can always define a custom JavaScript translator for the toString method on your custom value type, and its implementation in this case is really simple because you just want to display the one and only argument which is there, which is basically the GUID, the underlying type, because this is how it gets interpreted on the client side. So yeah, these are the custom value types. I think I feel like this is a nice nice feature which is somewhere in between those features that I showed you today, because at first we were talking about date only and time only, which was this which is really nice nice feature, but was fully implemented by .vvm team. Then we talked about record structs, and record structs which you can utilize yourself, basically provide your own types, but you have not much way on how to change their semantics when they are used by .vvm. And the third option, which are custom value types, you can basically create a custom type, define a way it gets serialized for a client, and also the way it's treated on server. So I feel like it's a nice mix of those both worlds that I showed you before. So at this point, I would like to thank you very much for attending this talk, and this will be all from me, but stay tuned because there will be I think at least 2 talks yet, so you'll see one of my colleagues next in a few minutes. So until then, thank you very much and see you next time.
So, hi, I'm Standa. I'm one of the DotVVM developers, and I also participate on developing some of the related projects, but I mostly do like the core framework. But this summer we decided to implement a VS Code extension. We have the full Visual Studio extension for years already, but yeah, like starting up Visual Studio just to try out DotVVM is not the most pleasant user experience for newcomers especially, or for front-end developers who don't want to use Visual Studio, or for Linux developers like me who have no way of installing Visual Studio. So we implemented like a more basic support for .vvm HTML markup in VS Code. And I guess this slide pretty much summarizes what it can do. It just auto-completes the .vvm specific HTML text and the .vvm specific HTML attributes or properties. This may suggest that it only supports like the core .vvm components. No, it also supports your user-defined components. So thank you for your attention, and any questions? Oh, okay, I will show how it works because I have some time for it. So in general, VS Code extensions work very differently to what we already know, the Visual Studio, the full Visual Studio, not code extensions. In the full Visual Studio, we essentially connect to 10,000 different interfaces to tweak how Visual Studio works. In VS Code, this is very different. I think we actually extend like 3 interfaces. And that's because there is only like pretty basic support for what you can communicate with the editor. But this basic support allows you to do pretty much anything. The major endpoint is like Visual Studio gives us, VS Code gives us the HTML markup user has written, where is the cursor, and ask us, okay, do autocomplete now. And in VS Code, this is usually not done in the VS Code process itself. Microsoft has designed a language server protocol so that we can write the plugin or the core of the plugin in any language we want. We don't have to run on the same Node.js runtime as VS Code does. And even though we actually wrote the language server in JavaScript, so it runs on Node.js anyways, we can still like at least control which version of Node we use so that we can use native modules for whatever we want. I will show later why we need them. And so what we use, we have VS Code, which is like, this diagram is not drawn according to the scale. The extension part is actually like really small. It's like a tiny glue code that only imports language server client and starts up the server. That's all. And there is syntax highlighting grammar, the text-made grammar. That's done in process in VS Code. It's pretty much not supported to do it out of process in the language server, I think. And the language server itself, as I said, is a Node.js process which uses three-setter parser. I will show later what it does. And this extension is open source. The Visual Studio not code extension is closed source and has some commercial features so that we can actually support the DotVVM development from something. This one is open source because it's much more basic, and also like publishing paid extensions in the VS Code marketplace is at least frowned upon, as far as I know. So we have the text-made grammar that's only used for VS Code syntax highlighting. And we have another grammar which is written in three-setter. Three-setter is like a grammar framework or parser generator. But this one actually generates usable syntax trees that we can then use for any smartness that we want. The TextMake grammar is essentially only tokenizing the string so that it can label this is blue and this is red. But you cannot create a syntax tree from it. And tree-setter is actually really cool. It supports incremental parsing, so when the user changes one character in the HTML, we don't have to reparse the entire document. So you don't have to wait 2 seconds before we are able to give you some auto-completions. And what is remarkable, I think, is that it does error recovery really well. In this example, you can see that I wrote data binding, which is missing the ending. And our parser that we use in Visual Studio Extension is kind of designed to also do recovery, but it cannot handle this case because the binding can contain pretty much anything and can be as long as you want. So it will just parse to the end of the document and then say, okay, I guess the binding ends here. But no tree-setter figures out that, okay, the binding is not ended anywhere, so it has to end somewhere, and it ends it like right after. I think it ends pretty much where it should end. And then it is able to autocomplete the next components. It's able to recognize that this is actually HTML. Looks more like HTML than C#, so I guess the binding ended. I think this is remarkable. I used to pretty much hate all parse generators because it was close to impossible to make them like error resistant. So it was kind of impossible to use it in like editor setting, but tree-setter is very different. And the grammar is compiled to C, which has the advantage that it runs pretty much anywhere. And it has really good bindings to Node.js and many other platforms. It used to be the way that when it was a C parser generator, it used to be impossible to generate a usable AST from it, but now tree-setter is different again. So the language server, how did we write it? When we started, we didn't know anything about language servers. So we just copied what they had in Svelte. Svelte is another front-end framework. I thought the markup is similar enough. So, and we had something to start working on by just copying their code. And yeah, we checked the licenses. It's MIT, I think, or Apache. We were allowed to do that. So from the start, we had something that worked, although it was doing Svelte autocompletion in the start. And then we were changing it piece by piece to do .vvm stuff. If you try the extension out and somewhere pops up something Svelte specific, yeah, it's maybe we missed something, but I don't think so. And it's a Node.js app. I guess you could expect that we would write it in .NET because .vvm is a .NET framework. But there is like large community of packages that simplify writing language servers. And also we didn't want to rewrite the HTML part, like suggesting HTML tags and attributes with their documentation. We didn't want to replicate it in C# just because we like C# more than JavaScript or TypeScript for that matter. And data for the autocompletion comes from a JSON file that .vvm serializes out. So let me show first that it actually works, that I am not lying, and sneak peek how it may work. So if I start writing out the dot prefix, it will autocomplete the .vvm component. And it will also autocomplete a user-defined component that we have in this project. This is like our test project for everything. And it will autocomplete its properties. I guess there is no visible then. There should be data source. Okay, data source is here. And how does it know which controls are defined? Well, .vvm, when it starts up, it serializes this kind of large JSON file, which contains your entire .vvm configuration. It's pretty much impossible to figure it out statically, so we have to do something like this, since the configuration is created by C# code that you write in your .vvm startup. And it also writes out all the properties for your controls. So if I try to search for the text repeater, we will find it out here. That is data source property and item text binding property. We can try out that. Yes, item text. Oh, I did. Item, yeah, it's here. So that's pretty much all the magic. There is like much more metadata that we currently don't use. We use some of the metadata from here in the bigger Visual Studio extension. So, but since we wrote the server in JavaScript or Node.js, how do we then find out like what .NET symbols are in your project? It would be really nice to be able to autocomplete, for example, this view model directive, which is like annoying to write since you have to specify full name of your view model. And yeah, I actually made it work. So how can this be done from a Node.js process? No, we didn't want to rewrite C# compiler in JavaScript. So we could take Roslyn compiler and create a new workspace, pretty much what a C# language server would do. The disadvantage is that this would kind of double memory usage of VS Code if you open it in .vvm solution, because you would have a normal C# language server that would consume a lot of Yeah, Roslyn is not very memory efficient. You would have normal OmniSharp language server, and then you would also have .vvm language server, which would do the same. So could we integrate with OmniSharp? Yeah, I was kind of thinking about this path, but then Microsoft said that they will, I guess, deprecate OmniSharp or replace it with some closed source language server. So at least they saved us some work by doing this. And the third option that we came up with was to get this data from the compiled DLLs. The disadvantage is that you have to compile your project to... If I wouldn't have the DLLs here, if I would just clone this project, I wouldn't get this auto-completion for view models. But you anyways need to run the project to get this serialized config, so I don't think it's too big of a disadvantage. Maybe if you add a view model, then you'd have to run .NET builds to get it here. But it simplifies a lot of things and makes the language server quite efficient, because parsing the DLLs is really much simpler than parsing C#. Another small advantage is that it will also support other languages that run on .NET, like F#. And so do we start another process or something? No. .NET 7 ships with ahead of time compiler, which can create like native library, which we can then link into the Node.js process. And I was thinking from the start that, okay, they added this, but we will see if it actually can run any real code. So I just to tease it, I included IC Sharpcode decompiler. It's the core of ILSpike decompiler. It's kind of convenient to use because they have built a C#-like type system based on only the DLLs. And I then compiled it with .NET Native, and yes, it was able to like at least get the list of types. I didn't try decompiling everything. Maybe it would crash on something. But yeah, I would say the .NET Native is quite capable since it can support large part of the ILSpike decompiler. And since it's so convenient, then why not just use it? It's not that large. The entire library is like 8 megabytes. If we would be able to use it in reflection-free mode, we would even get it to 6 megabytes only. But the reflection-free mode does not work for some reasons. And then we loaded this into the Node.js process as a Node native add-on. we need some C++ glue code in there to just get the data from .NET to JavaScript, but let's not talk about this part. And yeah, just if you download the VS Code extension, it's not there, it's still work in progress. I have a pull request here which implements it. You can try to check it out from the sources. It should be reasonably easy to build, at least on Linux, and I think my colleague added Windows support also. But we will try to get it into the release. So what are the plans? We don't really know what we want to do next, but we really want to finish this native add-on so that at least you can get the auto completion for that's wrong Visual Studio, for directives, and there are a few more directives like base type, which base type is only suggested in controls, but this will work here. And so there are a few places. It would be nice to have support for enums. So if you have a property, is the parser broke now? If you have property which is of type enum, like render settings mode, it would be nice if here we could suggest the fields of the enum. We don't have this in the serialized config. It would be nice to get it from the DLLs. And maybe we could even use this to support auto-completion inside of bindings. Like the bindings have like C# syntax, and no, I don't want to re-implement C# language server, but it shouldn't be that hard to like figure out that, okay, what kind of type is this, and then what properties are available on it. That shouldn't be too bad, I think. And other option what we could do is, since we didn't write too much VS Code specific code, as I said, the VS Code extension part is pretty small. Maybe the TextMate grammar was some work, but TextMate grammar is called TextMate grammar because it's from the TextMate editor, not from the VS Code editor. So maybe we could at least get TextMate support. And the language server protocol is actually supported by quite a few other editors that we could essentially get for free now. I think I didn't try it, but I think it could work. So if you have your favorite editor, like, I don't know, you use Vim all the time and need to have DotVVM auto-completion in Vim, then create an issue in the VS Code repository and we can have a look at that. So this is the actual end of the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat. Otherwise, bye from me. And I think Tom is coming for a short session now.
Hello again. I hope that you enjoyed the sessions from me and from my colleagues. It was a great pleasure to be here with you today at DotVVM Labs .NET Conf 2022. And I would like to ask you for just one thing. If you are using .vvm, give us your feedback. And if you haven't tried .vvm yet, if you see .vvm the first time, please go to our website and install the extension. Try to create a new project in .vvm and give us the feedback. It will be very important for our team so we can evolve the framework and give you new features. And of course, we will also be happy to hear about the things that you like on .NET 7 and ASP.NET Core and the new things Microsoft and the community is adding to .NET, because it's in the interest of all of us, so the .NET ecosystem and the .NET platform will grow. So here are several links. Our main website, .vvm.com. We also have a link to GitHub repo there, and our .vvm team is present on Gitter chat, gitter.im/riganti/.vvm, so you can ask any questions there. And of course, we are trying to make our documentation as explaining and as deep as possible. If you find any problems in the documentation, you can just tell us, report issues, or suggest pull requests with changes and updates to the documentation. So thank you very much for joining us today. We will be doing more virtual events like that, so follow us on Twitter, follow us on YouTube, and also we have a group at meetup.com, so you can join our group, and we are doing regular community meetups every month at every fourth Thursday in a month, so you will see them at meetup.com. So thanks for joining us today, and I would also like to thank the .NET Foundation for giving us the opportunity to talk about .vvm on their YouTube channel. So thank you all, and I will be looking forward to see you on some future events. So goodbye.